Hungry Trilobyte podcast would like to start by acknowledging SoonerCon. Set sail once again for the high seas of Oklahoma's longest-running pop culture convention. A fun weekend awaits you full of cosplay, shopping, celebrity autographs, panels, and the after-hours events. Set up in the Embassy Suites in Norman, Oklahoma, you'll find a fantastic geeky weekend, June 19th through 21st, 2026. Visit SoonerCon.com for details. Welcome to today's episode of the Hungry Trilobyte podcast. My name is Aaron Bossig, and I'm going to be your host. We talk a lot on this show about the more popular science fiction franchises, things like Star Trek, Star Wars, Marvel, DC, Lord of the Rings, and those tend to be what we see most in the United States or Europe. And to a degree, we kind of get a little bit of tunnel vision there and forget that there are perspectives from elsewhere in the world. And while you can't argue with the fact that some of these franchises dominate the conversation, there are perspectives that need to enter in. Today's guest is Candace Kade, and she has a fantastic original novel series that she's come up with that features a perspective that is based in China, and I want to get started right now. On mic today, we have Candace Kade. How are you doing this evening?
Hello, I'm doing wonderful. Thanks for having me here.
Glad to do it. I ran into you about 2 months ago at SoonerCon, and you dropped this book in my lap called Enhanced. It's the first in a series. I have gotten through the first one, and before I get to the second, I really need to talk to you about this.
Well, I am the right person. Let's talk. Let's
Okay.
do it.
Now, it's dystopian fiction, dystopian sci-fi. And the first thing I noticed was that with most dystopian sci-fi, there is this tendency to get wrapped up in this, oh, we're in the future and this is cool phase. Like, no matter how bad the world is, you have this moment where it's like you want to make it cool. And you don't do that. Like,
No.
your book is a legit dystopia from the first page. You already know, I wouldn't want to live in this world. And that was a neat play for me.
Right. I think a lot of it comes down to the origin story of the books. So
Hmm.
quick background on me. I moved to China. My backstory on me, when I was 4 years old, my family moved from Cleveland, Ohio to Changsha, China. And I grew up there, elementary school, middle school, high school, all the way until graduating high school, at which point I returned to the United States. And I went to Chinese public school part-time and then was homeschooled my English studies part-time. So grew up in China, came back to the States, went to college here, grad school, got my first job. And then while I was working, I actually was sent back to China on a relocation assignment, this time to Beijing, which is somewhere I had never lived before in China. And it was so strange to me to see sort of the time gap and the warp in which technology had changed in the 10 years since I had last lived there. I grew up in the 90s and in the 2000s in China when cell phones were not really, at least smartphones were not a thing. The internet felt like it was just starting. I remember having like a Yahoo email account, and that was really the only way I had of connecting with people back in the United States. And so I left that version of China and then I came back 10 years later and technology had just exploded. Everyone had smartphones and it was even more advanced than it was in the United States. Like no one had cash. Even if you were buying a 5 cent, pancake off of a street vendor, you're using your phone to do that. If you're getting on the subway every morning, which I was to get to work, use your phone to get on the subway. Everything was with your phone. And so it just made me think if this 10-year gap technology has changed this much, what will China look like 100 years from now? And so that's what really triggered the initial seed of the idea. And that's why a lot of, I think, the technology and the things you're describing are more of this realistic sort of dystopia and technology setting.
I gotta tell you that rings true. I can see where that came from for sure. I had a very unsettling thought earlier today that I was trying to think because this is China. I have never been to China. However, I've lived my whole life in the United States, and I could just think, wow, what if this moment I'm living in right now is somebody's dystopian fiction from the 1960s?
Hmm.
And I didn't like that thought very much. But then I'm thinking, I'm putting myself in your shoes 30 years ago in China, saying, wow, this this is the moment, this could be the moment that you could have pictured back then if that was something you wanted to do.
Yeah, I think actually a lot of what I pictured though came from my work in technology. I was working at Dell, the computer company. So I started writing this, gosh, I think it was about 8 years ago is when I started writing Enhanced. And back then, general population was not talking about AI. We were in technology, right? And so I was thinking about it, and that's why you see it in the book. But a lot of the things you see in the book were things that people on the cutting edge were just starting to talk about CRISPR gene editing technology, right? Like that exists. A lot of people have heard of it now, but back then, not that many people had heard about it or talking about it. AI, social credit score system, all these different things were things that, in my mind, are very real possibility, or they do exist, right? But they're more of what will they look like down the road? And even AI, right? If I were to write this book today, it would probably look different, right? Because all
Hmm.
these things have taken off. But at the time, 8 years ago, this was just sort of my vision of what our world could look like.
Yes, and again, without trying to belabor the point too much, I want to give you a lot of credit for not necessarily making that a positive thing. Because
Yes.
the book gets compared to Ready Player One a lot.
Hmm.
I think you even mentioned that comparison yourself. And I hesitate to rush to that because for that same reason is that I think Ready Player One does spend a lot of time making that world look cool. Like, oh wow, what if we could just have this big video game? And like, yeah, I actually think that would suck. Like a lot.
Right. Yeah, I do too. The world of Ready Player One. Yeah, I still agree because at the beginning it looks very cool, but as you
Hmm.
realize very quickly, you're like, no, actually, I wouldn't want to live in that. And I would say that's something that I feel like as the series goes on, I feel like I do try to show a hopeful side. Like, I don't want it to be, I feel like so many dystopian novels are just so
Hmm.
discouraging and I don't want to live there. And so, as an author living in this world for many years, writing this series, I wanted to create something that was a little bit more hopeful. So
Hmm.
there definitely are those discouraging elements of, wow, when you're born, either you're enhanced or you're not, and your DNA determines your destiny, right? So there are some of those more discouraging notes, but even like AI, there are the discouraging parts that there's the AI factories and there are these life-sucking places, and if you don't have the right genetic enhancements, you're going to get stuck working there. So there is that negative piece of it, but there is sort of a positive piece too, where people have like AI assistants who help prioritize their messages and help do different tasks. And so I did want, even with technology, to sort of not just make it like iRobot, technology is taking over, it's all bad, dystopia. I did want to create a little bit of a hopeful lens to it. And I hope that that grows a little bit. I almost want the reverse. A lot of sci fi, cool tech, but here's this dystopian world and government, it's all falling apart. And I almost want to do the opposite of, you know, here's this realistic world and here's some of the discouraging and sad downsides to this technology, but as the series goes on I want to show some of the hopeful elements to it.
I'm looking forward to that because, like I said, I've read through the first book. I will get to the others, but I just thought this, and maybe I would be useful to kind of take a step back and just kind of give a broad level version of the story here. It is about a girl named Urban who is going off to college. She lives in a world of people who are the wealthy upper class are genetically enhanced. She is not. The reasons for this are very complex. That's what the book's about. So I'm not going to go any spoilers. I'm not in that business. But she has a great deal of, I would say, intrigue going through her life as to how this came to be and who she can trust and who she can't. Is this fair? Am I
Yeah,
okay?
absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
And yeah, I really felt like there was a lot in there that I noticed that the technology, like you said, you were in that world, you were using current references based on your point of view 8 years ago. A lot of it does ring true now. And I'm even going to make this distinction. The stuff that rings true, you had a great vision for how things could shape out. The stuff that doesn't ring true right now is kind of almost by chance, and we can't rule it out just yet. I think it's a little bit of a there, but for the grace of God, go I sort of thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cryptocurrency, I'm looking in your direction.
Yep, yep. Yeah, yeah, it was really fun too because having worked in tech, a lot of my friends are in tech. So, I have friends who are AI product managers, back when it was first starting, or who are cybersecurity analysts, or who are developers. I also have a lot of family members who are doctors and in sort of the scientific biomedical community. So it was really fun to get to just bounce a lot of these ideas past them and say, is this even a realistic vision? Here's what I'm thinking. I have this story plot idea. Does this work? What about this? So it was also really cool to get to, tie in a lot of my community and experts in their different fields and kind of pick their brain on some of these different elements. And like you said, some of it has gotten more realistic, and some of it's like, well, we'll see. Maybe I still have hopes for some of them, but we'll see.
Let's maybe I'm just going to ask your opinion here because I this is totally author's choice here. Do you think that because we're now so entrenched in this technology world compared to the way we were 40, 50 years ago, that somebody like me who's sitting down to read a science fiction novel really needs to understand that these are real concepts that real people are making actual money working on right now? Or is that just kind of like a fringe benefit for me?
Yeah, I don't think you have to. I think there's tons of people who have picked up my novel who don't have a lot of people have picked up my novel who don't traditionally read
Hmm.
sci-fi. And those people don't know a lot of these things. When I talk to them in person, say, "Hey, have you heard of CRISPR gene editing technology?" They're like, "No." Have you played around with AI? No. So you don't need to know about these specific things. I do think it has an added benefit, an added layer of depth. It's almost like each of my books have Easter eggs in them, and these are actually Mandarin cultural related Easter eggs. Like on the covers, there's some different characters, Chinese characters that have something to do with the plot or the theme on each of the books. The chapter headings. I don't know if you noticed, but at the very end, those chapter headings they stayed the same throughout the whole book, but at the very end they changed, and that was very significant. You know, for people who are listening for the first time. Again, I don't want to give spoilers, but it has to do with Urban's internal growth and sort of what she's learning on this journey. So I planted a lot of like cultural Easter eggs, and I almost see it. It's not quite an Easter egg, but I almost see it as like this added layer of people who understand these technologies have this added layer to the story that they can gain. Same as people who have lived in China, been to China, who are of Chinese descent, there's also an added layer of understanding that you can get. So again, you don't need to be Chinese to read my book. You don't need to be some sort of technological expert or enjoy reading about those things, but there is an added layer of benefit, I would say.
For sure. And again, never been to China, but I really did appreciate how there's a lot of Chinese culture woven into your book in a way that is not surface level. You can tell the person who wrote it has a very, as much of a deep understanding of the culture as a non-native person can get.
Hmm.
Obviously, you weren't born there, but you were there long enough that you did absorb quite a bit of it. Yeah, and that comes through very clear. And it's not hammered into you. You just kind of get the tones, especially not a spoiler, but need to, especially in the character of the mother.
Mm.
I think that really is the cleanest, easiest way of saying, okay, this is different than the life I know. Not in a bad way,
Mm.
but it takes a while to get used to, and it does rub you the wrong way at first.
Yeah, yeah, it is very different. And the family unit is very different in China. When I used to live there was when they had the active one child policy. And so most of my friends had no siblings versus I grew up with two brothers. And so everyone was always so surprised, wow, you have siblings. Wow, it was just a strange concept to them. And for us, it was never like, oh, we're going to go over to so and so's house and all of us are going to have kids to play with. No, it's my friend or it's my brother's friends, but there's no siblings for all of us to play with. And so that dynamic was different. And that's why I don't know if you noticed it, but I briefly alluded to it in the book of we had almost gone full circle back to that in this series where the poor can't afford children and so they're just having one. Only the elite wealthy have more than one child. And so I even make a reference to that. But yeah, growing up in China, the mother dynamic was very much something that was based off of my friends. A lot of them had sort of that personality that you notice in the mother is very much based off of my friends' mothers.
Mhm.
And sometimes, yeah, I think for me, even when I first moved there, it was a little getting used to just like the whole culture. But now it feels like it feels very natural to me.
And again, that's going to be a very, very stark contrast to most American lives. And yet at the same time, the concept of a 17, 18-year-old girl going off to college, starting her life of independence. And that's something that rings true to almost everybody who's going to read this. That part you can connect to right away.
Right. Yeah, it was such an interesting balance trying to strike universal truths. I want anyone who speaks, reads English to be able to consume this story and relate to it. But on the other end, to your point, I wanted to be culturally relevant and, showcase China in a way that is authentic and true and positive. And so it was a difficult balance to walk. There's certain things that I included in the first draft that I realized when I realized my goal was to publish this in America, to have an American publisher pick this up. There were certain things that I had to take out or weave more seamlessly into the story because I realized, oh, American readers aren't going to understand this cultural reference. I'm going to have to either belabor the point and explain it to the point where we get pulled out of the plot line, or I'm going to have to figure out a more creative way to sort of weave this into the story.
And now, as a science fiction writer, you have a third option almost, wherein you can just say, okay, the audience won't understand this, so I can just make a new thing. You
That's
you can
true. We always have that out. That's absolutely true. Yes.
Mhm.
I think there's less options when it's near future and it's very much based on reality, but you're right. I can occasionally get away with that.
So since I haven't read all this, and if this is a spoiler, forgive me on this, but is this a story of a parallel timeline where different things have already happened in the past, or is this a potential future we can already see? Does the story depend on this reality now leading to that reality then?
Yeah. Yes. The latter.
Okay, cool. And that helps quite a bit because you can see, yeah, this is where we're going, this or theoretically could be where we're going.
Theoretically, yes. I'm
Uh,
sure things will change. There's very few sci-fi authors I feel like who've completely nailed it. There are a few, right? There are a few,
mhm,
but things will probably change.
sure. With science fiction, with especially dystopian fiction, I there's always a tendency to dwell on the technology because we talked about CRISPR, AI, crypto. These things are important, but it's the shift in culture that I always find really interesting when we start prognosticating on this sort of thing here. And I like looking at how, on one hand, let's say this family unit remains reasonably traditional, and yet there is still a discussion on what your path is going to, what sort of culture, a career you can have after college. That's a very active discussion, and it's definitely a China centered discussion. They're not looking to say, oh, maybe I should go to this other country. I don't even know what the rest of the world is like from the perspective of this book. So, is that something that you did deliberately?
I think that was something when I set out to write this book, I wasn't even setting out to write sci-fi. Normally, I write fantasy novels. This is kind of the exception. Now I love sci-fi and I have a million sci-fi ideas.
Mhm.
But first diving into it, again, I wasn't setting out to do that. It was just being in Beijing and surrounded by tech and how everything had changed. I just started writing it. And so when I was thinking about what is the story that I want to tell, I knew I wanted to write young adult because I tend to bounce in terms of genre, fantasy, contemporary, sci fi. The one unifying feature is I like to write within the age range of young adult. So with young adult, I had to think about okay, I want this to be set in a futuristic Beijing, but what makes sense for the main character? If she's going to be going out on these adventures, changing the world, how does this really make sense? And so I set it against the backdrop of university. Again, this was 8 years ago. Now I probably would change that because I see more and more universities and the benefits of them. It's starting to shift, right? With so much online resources and AI. I don't know if I'm sure university as it is today it won't exist, right? It'll be in some different format or maybe it'll have changed altogether and people are going to vo-tech schools. Who knows? I don't know,
Mhm.
right? And so that is something that I think my view on has changed. But at the time, I don't think my goal in writing this series was let me nail all the cultural, scientific, technological trends. I think I was really just thinking about what are some of the obvious ones? Let's hit those low hanging fruit. But really, I wanted to write a story about someone who really straddled two different cultures, the world of the enhanced and the world of those who aren't. And how is she handling this society in which you can't be both. You have to be one or the other. You can't be both. And it was even mirroring my own experience of spending nearly half my life in China and half of it in the West, and feeling like I constantly had to choose. You need to be American or you need to be Chinese, but I constantly wanted to choose both. And so I didn't even realize I was writing that into it at the time. But for me, it was more about her internal arc and the characters rather than the cultural impact or some of the institutions that were in place.
That's pretty profound there. And I really click with a lot of stories where you're being told you have to be something, and that's not necessarily what you are. And I think a lot of our world, our external world, is framed that way. It's like you have to fit yourself into the pigeonhole because that's what everybody else needs you to do. And you have the right as a human being to say, I don't fit that description.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to pretend I do.
And so many people don't. And so that's why I think a lot of people resonate with this story, even if they're not, like you said, you resonate with that. You've never grown up in China, right?
No.
There's so many people, for whatever reason, we don't feel like we fit into that neat box that society has told us we need to be. And so this is really a story for anyone who's ever felt like an outsider or like they want to be something other than society tells them they have to be.
And I almost have to wonder how many other characters in the book, or just like I'm wondering how many people in the real life are feeling that, man, I don't want to be in this pigeonhole. How many characters in that book might be having a similar conflict that we just aren't privy to because we're not seeing? And you're nodding like maybe I'm catching on to something. Like,
You are there.
okay,
I won't give spoilers, but you're onto something.
gotcha, gotcha, gotcha. And I mean, I will also say that there are some twists at the end of the book that are cleverly signaled, and somebody who is enjoying themselves might suspect are coming but won't know for sure. And I love that.
Thank you. Thank you. Man, the ending of Enhance, I had to completely rewrite it 4 times
Mhm.
because I like to plan my novels out, but there's still a degree of changes that happen when you're writing it. You realize certain characters are unruly, they're not doing what you said they were going to do or plan for them. One said character did exactly that, and that's why the whole ending of Enhance had to change because this specific character she blazed her own trail and everything changed. So yeah, I don't think even I saw those plot twists coming. I was very surprised by them and I had to figure out what to do about them.
I always say one of the worst things any story can do is be boring, or
Mm,
even worse than boring is predictable.
yes,
Your
I
story,
agree.
yeah, your story takes a good path. It's leading in a direction, but it is never predictable. You never quite see things coming, even if you kind of wonder. And that's a nice line to walk.
That's the line I shoot for. I enlist lots of beta readers' help to try and figure out, is this too obvious? Is this not obvious whatsoever? To try and find that balance. I have my beta readers and my mini critique partners to thank for that. And so far the feedback I've gotten on all 3 novels is there's those plot twists, some that you see coming, but there's always I try and shoot for one that you don't see coming.
And I mean, great job on that all around. So, what kind of response have you gotten from the book since it's been released?
Yeah, really positive. People, like you said, they love the plot twists. They also, I think the second thing they really enjoy is the world building and like we touched on sort of those cultural elements. And then the third thing people really love is the fight scenes. I can't remember if I told you this when we met, but I have a martial arts background.
You did
And
tell me that, yeah.
so,
Mhm.
okay, yes. And so I love writing the fight scenes and people love reading those. But people also, going back to the heart of the story, people also love Urban and her journey through each of the books and some of those deeper themes that we touch on. Because I love the action, I love the plot twist when I'm reading a book. That's what I'm looking for, the world building, all those things. But I don't want to just, watch the next Fast and Furious. I want something that has soul to it. I want some of the themes and underlying reasons that the story exists other than it's a cool fight scene, right? So people have also said they enjoy some of those deeper themes.
Have you had any feedback from people who live in China and have for a while?
Yeah, I have. Some of my very earliest beta readers are Chinese or Chinese who have migrated to America, now live here. And so, yeah, I had some of them read it too. And it was really encouraging to hear their feedback and their take on how authentic all of it was. And the only thing that ever didn't ring true to one of them was a very small, one of the hybrid is set around Chinese New Year. And so there's a lot of different foods that I talk about. And one of the foods she said she hadn't heard before, but it's actually taken from Hong Kong, which is a lot of their traditions are separate there than mainland China.
Hmm.
And so that actually was fine because the world of New Beijing encompasses Hong Kong and some of the surrounding countries. So technically, she was right. It might not have made sense for Beijing, but because I've kind of morphed that setting a little bit, it actually did make sense. So, all that to say, it was very encouraging to me that all the technical details, cultural details were spot on according to them.
Fair enough. Fair enough. And I would again wonder, just for a China of the future that is as powerful as this nation seems to be, albeit with whatever difficulties it might have, I would be surprised if they weren't able to absorb some of the surrounding culture and especially their food items or economic goods, and even around the world if need be. I mean, if I would find it hard to believe this if they wanted tea from England or vegetables from South America if they didn't have the ability to get those, because clearly these are people of means.
Right. And that's the other thing too, is like we're becoming more and more global citizens, right? There's when I was living in Beijing, a lot of my Chinese coworkers were watching American shows, right? Or now there's a huge phenomenon in America where so many people are watching K-dramas, right? So we have this like shared culture and people in America are eating Chinese food. In China they have Starbucks, so to your point, there's also a lot of that global commoditization. And so it wouldn't be surprising to see foods from somewhere else there.
Hmm. I'm glad you didn't dip into that too much because, like I said, I see it being possible, but it's the flavor of the book that of the China in your book that's really worthwhile that gives it its personality.
Right.
So you have a book, one of three. Do you have any thoughts of continuing in this universe after the trilogy is done?
I do. I've thought about writing a short story or even a prequel, but that might just be my coping mechanism of
Hmm.
not feeling like the series is done and I've left it, which is sort of bittersweet, right? I've been in that world from when I started writing Enhance to when I got my publishing deal to turning in the very last line, the very last round of edits on the last book. It's been 7 years that I've been in that world. Thankfully, I love the world, but yeah, it's been a long time. And so I think the part of me that's still very attached to that world keeps saying, I should write a short story in that world with Ash's background or Coral or Lucas, which are some of people's favorite side characters. Or I should just write the prequel on, how did things get the way they are? And I might someday, but that might, again, just be a coping mechanism. So I feel like I'm not saying goodbye to the series.
I can realize how hard that would be, and I wonder how many authors do fall into that trap of just wanting to write for their own self gratification. And there's nothing wrong with that. No judgment whatsoever.
Right, right. I'm a trilogy kind of gal though. I like to write in trilogies. That gives me just enough time to really feel invested in the world, the characters. But also I'm not someone who's gonna drag the books on for, you know, long series. That's just I felt like wrapping up book 3 was already challenging enough with all the characters you've introduced, all the themes, subplots. Man, that's already so hard to wrap up in a trilogy. I can't even imagine folks who are writing 5, 6, 7, 8 books. That would just be an absolute nightmare to wrap up. So I don't want to do that to myself, or my readers who would have to wait for me to finish that. So I keep it simple.
Yeah. You're not the George R. R. Martin type.
No, no, I'm not.
Although now I'm thinking of that, although I wouldn't want to see your book be Game of Thrones, I could definitely see that style playing well to the story you're telling.
Yes. Yeah, the fast action, the cyberpunk vibes.
Hmm.
Yes.
The constant twist, the never knowing who to trust,
Mm-hmm. Sort of the
that
mysterious elements.
the
Yeah.
two would dovetail very well together.
Right. Well, an author can always dream.
Absolutely. I used to ask people, what do you saw your book becoming down the road? And I realized that's really not fair because everybody would want it to be a book,
Right.
TV show, movie. There's nobody
Right.
that doesn't
Of
want that.
course. Yeah.
But the fact is, you did this now and you should be proud of it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Of course. Yeah, I would love to see all the things. I would love to see a graphic novel too. I feel like it would also lend itself amazingly to a graphic novel with the colors, the vibrant colors, and like sort of the Asian elements and the action. I also feel like it'd lend itself really well to that.
I almost suggested that. I stopped myself just because you have a very visual style in how you describe things, and it plays well to the theater of the mind aspect for somebody who reads a lot, really enjoys filling in the details. And I wondered if maybe it was you'd almost rob the reader of that. But if you found the right artist, this could be a masterpiece.
Ah, yeah, I think it's all about finding the right artist, man. I don't know a whole lot about the process of finding a graphic novel artist and publishing deal. I studied the how to get published with a book and traditional publishing. I studied that path because it takes a long time and it's a while getting there. But yeah, I once I'm off deadline and finished with the book launch and all the process and all of that, and have more free time, I should look into that because yeah, I would love to see that.
Definitely a worthwhile project for sure. Um, in the meantime, uh, do you have any plans outside the trilogy into back into fantasy, or are you going to try to stick for something a little more sci-fi from here on out?
I have so many sci-fi ideas that have come up since writing this series, but I don't want to pigeonhole myself in sci-fi. So I do want to switch and go back to fantasy and write that. Most sci-fi readers will read fantasy as well, so I think it's a pretty good transition. But yeah, I think I want to go back to horses and battles and sort of elemental magic systems, but still with lots of world building and heart. So yeah, I'm working on a fantasy project now that's sort of like Avatar: The Last Airbender meets Red Queen that I'm really excited about. But it's bare bones, baby stage, so I got nothing to show for it right now. Just
Okay.
trying to crank it out.
So you have again three sci-fi novels. How many fantasy novels under your belt?
I only have, let's see, half of a trilogy written and then a contemporary book. And then this will be the sixth or seventh novel I've written.
Okay, so that's a good number. And there's probably somebody in the audience right now who's maybe fleshing out a short story, or they've got an outline, or maybe they just know they have a great idea and they're trying, but they just don't quite know how to put it together into an actual book form. What would be your advice to that person?
Oh, so much advice. First of all, don't give up. It's hard work. Second of all, I think find like critique partners and people who you can swap manuscripts. It's really important to find good ones though, not just people who are going to rip you apart and not be helpful, but people who will encourage you, but at the same time help sharpen your craft, and at the same time you can help them and them sharpen their craft. I've learned so much from my critique partners. They've taught me so much, but at the same time I've helped them, right? I've helped them with their world building and their fight scenes. Every writer, I truly believe, has their own unique strengths and weaknesses. And so when you bring critique partners in, you get to help them with your strengths and they help you with yours. So that really helped me become a stronger writer when I started having critique partners. But if you're really, stage one, you're figuring out the craft of writing, how do you tell a story? I mean, first just read lots of stories, right? If you want to write adult dystopian novels, read adult dystopian novels, right? If you want to write women's fiction, be reading women's fiction. Be an avid reader in your genre, and your critique partner should be too, by the way. To be an avid reader, but then for the actual bones of it, figuring out the plot and the structure, a book that was really helpful to me was Save the Cat Writes a Novel. I didn't discover it till after I'd written my second or third book, and I still just felt like the pacing in my novels was off. I couldn't quite figure out the internal arc versus external need of the character. All these different pieces weren't quite gelling together for me. And then once I read that novel, so many things just clicked in my brain. And so I recommend it to all authors who are just starting out, or maybe who have written one or two books but are really wrestling with plot and structure and still don't have a good grasp on that. Other people really like the snowflake method. There is a lot of different plotting books out there, but for me, I really enjoyed Save the Cat Writes a Novel, and I recommend that to everyone.
Good to know. Well, I'm going to make sure I put that in the show notes on my website, aaronbossick.com. Where can people find more of your adventures? Where can they check out the next book and see what you're up to from here on out?
They can find my books anywhere books are sold, an ebook, paperback, hardback, and audiobook format. And then they can also connect with me on Instagram. I'm most active there at Candace Kade Author, or on my website, Candace Kade, and they can sign up for my newsletter where I give book recommendations that are young adult. I do a lot of bookish giveaways, or they can just keep up with me there.
Okay. Candace, I want to thank you so much for being here. I would be glad to have you back anytime. I will be checking out that second novel, so that may be a good excuse for us to get back together and have another chit chat.
Amazing. I love it. Thank you so much for having me.
I would like to thank Candace for being my guest today, and I would like to thank you for listening. We talk so much about how science fiction is a universe of possibilities, that you're limited only by your imagination. But don't forget that science fiction fans have so many perspectives. The perspectives they offer are a universe into themselves, and we can only broaden that universe as we bring in different types of stories into the conversation. So, for people like Candace that are making completely different types of stories and writing novels that could take off and create an entire universe for our enjoyment, let's go ahead and appreciate that. I'd like to hear your works. Are you working on something right now? Are you reading something right now that is just completely different? Drop me a line at bossigpodcast@yahoo.com, or follow me at Aaron Bossig on Blue Sky or Instagram. You can subscribe to this show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, Amazon, YouTube. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.